Welcome back to She Rises Daily, Emerging You in 10. I'm your host, DocShellie, here to bring you your daily dose of inspiration, empowerment, and growth. How often have you heard someone say, "That's just who I am," or maybe, "That's just how he is," or, "You know how she is," and somehow that is supposed to settle the matter. They're direct, they are impatient, they're intense, they avoid conflict, they don't trust people, they have a temper, but hey, that's just how they are. And I have to tell you, this is one of my big pet peeves, because sometimes that line, "That's just who I am," does reflect genuine self-awareness. You actually recognize something about yourself, which is great. And sometimes that phrase becomes a convenient way to stop examining behavior. We identify a pattern, give it a label, and then act as though the label makes the behavior inevitable. So today, I want to challenge that, because self-awareness should expand your choices, not eliminate them. Knowing how you tend to behave isn't the end of the conversation. It is where choice begins. A pattern can explain your behavior without excusing it. Let's say you know that when you're under pressure, you become impatient. That is useful information. Or maybe when conflict shows up, you tend to avoid it. Again, useful information. Maybe when you care deeply about something, you become controlling. Maybe you get defensive when you receive feedback. Perhaps when you're overwhelmed, you withdraw. Those are patterns, and recognizing them is self-awareness. And here's where we sometimes go sideways. I'm impatient. That's just how I am. I hate conflict. I've always been that way. I'm controlling because I just don't care. Now, we've taken awareness and we've turned it into an inevitability. Knowing your pattern should actually give you more ability to interrupt it. If I know I become impatient under pressure, then I can recognize it sooner. I can pause, and then I could change my language. I could ask a question instead of snapping back at somebody. If I know my instinct is to avoid conflict, I could notice myself avoiding and choose to enter the conversation anyway. A pattern can explain your behavior without excusing your behavior. That's the difference between simply knowing yourself and actually using what you know. A strength, value, or trait is not a permission slip. And we don't only do this with personality. We do it with strengths, values, leadership competencies, organizational behaviors. I once worked for an organization that had a core behavior called Be Bold. And I actually liked the behavior. I believe in being bold, speaking up, challenging thinking, taking appropriate risks, saying the things that need to be said. All good stuff. Except, quite frequently, someone would make an announcement. "Well, I'm going to be bold here." And I learned to brace myself a little, because most of the time what followed wasn't boldness. It was unnecessarily harshness, dismissive, aggressive, or behavior that probably wouldn't have been acceptable if we hadn't slapped the word bold on it first. Basically, "I'm going to be bold now," translated to "buckle up, I'm about to be a jackass." And that's the danger. We can take perfectly good language and use it to justify behavior without examining its impact. I'm just direct. I'm being authentic. I'm challenging the status quo. I'm a truth teller. I have high standards. Okay, but what are you actually doing? Because calling something bold doesn't automatically make it constructive. Calling something direct doesn't automatically make it respectful. Calling something authentic doesn't absolve you from responsibility for its impact. A strength doesn't stop being accountable just because it's a strength. Neither does a value. The label doesn't determine the quality of the behavior. The behavior determines the quality of the behavior. I've had versions of this conversation countless times in coaching. Someone will describe a behavior that's creating problems for them. Maybe they're receiving feedback that they come across too strongly. Maybe they're avoiding difficult conversations. Maybe they're struggling to delegate. Maybe they're stepping in and taking over. And somewhere in the explanation, they will say, "That's just how I am." And I understand what they usually mean. They're saying, "This comes naturally to me." Those are not the same statement. "That's how I am" sounds fixed. "That's what comes naturally to me" leaves room for choices. So sometimes I'll ask, does the fact that this comes naturally mean it's the only response available to you? Of course it doesn't. And now we have somewhere to go. Because development doesn't require you to become someone else. It asks you to become more intentional about how you use who you already are. That's a completely different goal. Authenticity doesn't mean acting on every natural impulse. This is another word we've occasionally gotten sideways. Authenticity. I'm just being authentic. Great. But every version of yourself doesn't need equal airtime. I can authentically think something and still choose not to verbalize it. I can authentically feel defensive and still choose curiosity. I can authentically prefer avoiding conflict and still initiate a difficult conversation. I can authentically be angry and still decide I want to express that anger. That's not being fake. That is self-regulation. That is having range. Authenticity without self-regulation isn't authenticity at all. It's impulse with good branding. Being authentic doesn't mean everybody around you simply has to absorb whatever comes naturally out of you. You still have responsibility for your impact. Authenticity isn't behaving exactly the same way in every situation. Authenticity is staying connected to who you are while intentionally choosing how you show up. Growth isn't becoming less you, it's having more ways to be you. And this is where I think development sometimes gets framed incorrectly. We think growth means becoming less of whatever we naturally are, less direct, less emotional, less intense, less cautious, less driven, less independent, and I don't particularly love that. Maybe growth isn't about becoming less you. Maybe it is about developing more ways to be you. You can be direct and diplomatic. You can be confident and curious. You can be independent and collaborative. You can be driven and patient. You can be compassionate and boundaried. You can be bold and respectful. We've talked before about the power of and. Here's another place it matters. You don't have to eliminate the trait. You develop range around it. And the more range you have, the more choices you have. That is growth. It's not about becoming someone else. It is becoming increasingly intentional about how you show up. Here's your reflection question. What behavior have you been describing as, "That's just who I am," that might actually be a pattern you have more choice around than you've realized? And perhaps an even more difficult question. Where might you be using something positive about yourself, a strength, a value, authenticity, high standards, to justify an impact you need to examine? And your power thought, self-awareness should give you more choices about how you show up, not fewer. Know yourself, absolutely. Understand your strengths, your tendencies, your preferences, your patterns. Know what comes naturally to you. Know what happens when you're stressed. Understand where your strengths have edges. Don't turn that knowledge into a permission slip. "That's just who I am" does not have to mean, therefore, this is how I will always behave. It can mean, this is something I know about myself, and because I know it, I have more ability to choose what I do with it. That's real self-awareness, not awareness that confines you. This is awareness that gives you agency, because the goal is to become more intentional about which version of you the moment needs. This week, listen for yourself saying or thinking, "This is just how I am." And when you catch it, don't judge it, just add a question. And what choices do I have because I know that about myself? And if you catch yourself using a strength, a value, or a positive label to explain your behavior, ask one more question. Is the way I'm expressing this creating the impact I intend? That's where awareness becomes responsibility. As always, thank you for joining me for another episode of She Rises Daily, Emerging You in 10. If today's episode made you think of someone who has ever used "that's just who I am" as though it were a legally binding behavioral exemption, share this episode with them. Maybe anonymously. Use your judgment. And until next time, remember, your personality is not a permission slip. Your strengths aren't an excuse. Your values don't exempt you from examining your impact. Know yourself well enough to recognize what comes naturally, and trust yourself enough to know you still get to choose what comes next.